Hong Kong's skyline is a portrait of prosperity, a forest of luxury high-rises against a neon sky. It's one of the richest cities on Earth. But beneath those dazzling towers lies a very different Hong Kong. Down a narrow alley or up a tenement stairwell, you'll find coffin homes. Tiny, subdivided flats where people live in spaces sometimes smaller than a parking spot. Here, a single room might be split into a dozen cubicles, each barely big enough for a bunk bed and some possessions. Families squeeze into units the size of closets. This is Hong Kong's housing nightmare, hiding in plain sight. How did it come to this? How did a gleaming global finance hub end up with residents living in cages? Officials often blame nature. Hong Kong is mountainous, with little flat land. But is this crisis really due to a land shortage or something else? Today, we uncover the uncomfortable truth behind Hong Kong's housing and how it broke the city's social contract. For those unfamiliar with Hong Kong, here's the big picture. This city of 7.5 million people sits on rocky islands and a peninsula. Space is at a premium, or so we're told. Housing here is famously expensive and cramped. In fact, Hong Kong has ranked as the world's most unaffordable housing market for over a decade. The average home costs around 16.7 years' worth of an average family's income, meaning if a family saved every dollar and spent nothing on food or anything else, it would still take them nearly 17 years to afford a home. By some earlier measures, it was even worse. Over 20 years' income for a home in 2019. No wonder so many feel buying a flat is out of reach. And what do you get for those staggering prices? Not much space. The average Hong Kong apartment is about 480 square feet, roughly 45 square meters. Divide that by the typical household size, and you get just 160 square feet per person on average. To put that in perspective, that's about the size of a single parking space for each person. And many live in far less. In public housing estates, individuals often have only 130 square feet of space each. And in the infamous coffin homes, subdivided private flats, units can be as small as 8 square meters, 86 square feet. That's literally half the size of a typical US parking spot. The median subdivided unit is about 10 square meters, 110 square feet, often just enough room for bed and a tiny walkway. Approximately 110,000 of these cubicles house some 220,000 people in Hong Kong, meaning 1 in 30 Hong Kongers lives in a space most would consider a closet. How can this be? Hong Kong's overall density is high, millions of people packed into tight urban areas. Yet if you look at land use, you find a striking fact. Only about 24% of Hong Kong's land is developed, and just 7% is zoned for housing. Yes, only 7% of the land area is where all those apartments and homes exist. The rest is made up of country parks, steep hills, forests, reservoirs, rural areas and other uses. In fact, roughly 3/4 of Hong Kong's territory is green or undeveloped, a shocking contrast in a city known for its density. This means the housing shortage isn't simply because Hong Kong ran out of land, it's because most land is off-limits or unused. Fly a camera drone over Hong Kong and you'll see it clearly. Dense clusters of skyscrapers hugging the shoreline, and just beyond them, vast green hills and open spaces. The city looks full at ground level, but from above you see plenty of land. It's just not being used for housing. Why does this matter now? Because the housing crisis is eroding Hong Kong's social fabric. It's not just a real estate issue, it's fueling inequality, frustration, and even upheaval. Hong Kong's income inequality is among the highest in the developed world, with a Gini coefficient over 0.5. The wealth gap largely runs along property lines, those who own a home versus those who never will. That inequality has contributed to social unrest. Analysts often point out that the massive protests in 2019 were not only about politics, but also deep discontent over living conditions and limited opportunities. When a whole generation realizes they might never afford a decent home, it breeds resentment. We also see it in personal choices. Hong Kong's birth rate has collapsed to about 0.8 children per woman, one of the lowest in the world. Ask young Hong Kongers why they aren't having kids, and many will say, how can we raise a child in a 200 square foot apartment? People delay marriage and parenthood because housing is so costly and cramped. And then there's the brain drain. In recent years, tens of thousands of residents have left the city. From mid-2021 to mid-2022 alone, the population fell by around 120,000 people, some leaving for political reasons, others simply seeking a better quality of life where housing isn't an impossible dream. In short, Hong Kong's housing crisis touches everything: the economy, the youth, family life, and the very promise of the city. To understand why this is happening, we need to debunk the easy explanation: there's just no land, and examine the policies and powers that have made housing such a cage. The first thing to clear up is the myth of land scarcity. If you ask officials or developers why housing is so limited, they'll often shrug and say, well, Hong Kong is small. We just don't have enough land for everyone. It sounds reasonable. Hong Kong is only about 1,100 square kilometers, and much of it is mountains and country parks. But this narrative is misleading. As we saw, only 7% of Hong Kong's land is used for housing, and roughly 75% of the land is not developed at all. A significant portion of that is protected countryside. Around 40% of Hong Kong's land is designated country park. Environmental stewardship is great. Hong Kong's lush green peaks are beautiful and provide a backyard for the city. But it also means large swathes are off limits to builders. Beyond parks, there are also fallow rural lands, old villages, even an expansive golf course, and brownfield sites, like old container yards, that sit underutilized. It's not that no land exists, it's that land isn't being made available for housing. On a map, Hong Kong's urban areas are mostly along the northern shore of Hong Kong Island and the southern edge of the Kowloon Peninsula, plus a few new towns in the new territories. These areas are hyper-dense. But notice the vast green areas on the map. The new territories have large patches of farmland and grassy hills, and Hong Kong Island's interior is largely country park. There is land. It's just very tightly controlled. Over the years, some have pointed out that Hong Kong's government could rezone or develop a bit more of this land to ease the housing shortage. For example, using some of the less ecologically sensitive areas or repurposing that huge century-old Fanling golf course for housing. In fact, only a few years ago, a debate raged about taking part of the 170-hectare golf course to build public housing. Many argued it was absurd to keep land for a golf club while people live in cages. The government eventually decided to use a portion of it for housing, but progress has been slow. This story highlights a key point. The scarcity is often manufactured by policy choices and politics, not absolute physical limits. Another example: housing versus agriculture. In the new territories, some land is zoned for village housing or farming, with old laws protecting small villages. About 7% of Hong Kong's land is still rural housing or agriculture, some of which isn't efficiently used. A lot of that land is actually owned by developers waiting for permission to build. It sits as unofficial land banks. So again, land exists, but it's kept out of the supply pipeline. The bottom line is, the no land excuse doesn't tell the full story. Yes, Hong Kong is geographically constrained, but the extreme density is also a result of planning and policy. By zoning only a tiny fraction of land for homes and strictly limiting new development, the city has created an artificial scarcity. This ensures that whatever housing does exist becomes incredibly expensive. Think of it this way: Hong Kong's land is like a pie. Right now, the slice allocated to housing is tiny, and everyone is fighting for a piece of that tiny slice, driving prices through the roof. Meanwhile, the rest of the pie is largely untouched. This isn't nature's fault. It's the outcome of decisions about how to use land. So if the crisis isn't simply because Hong Kong has no land, what is causing it? To answer that, we need to look at the machine that drives Hong Kong's housing market, a set of deliberate policies and economic forces. Hong Kong's housing system isn't chaotic or accidental. In many ways, it's systematic. Picture an engine with three main cogs all turning together. 1. Government land policy. 2. Developer oligopoly. And 3. Fiscal dependency on land revenues. These three pillars form a kind of iron triangle that keeps home prices high. Let's break them down one by one. The first pillar is the government's own high land price strategy. Hong Kong's government, unique in the world, owns virtually all the land in the territory. Private citizens and companies don't own land freehold. Instead, they lease land from the government, usually on 50-year or 99-year terms. This system dates back to British colonial days and continued after the 1997 handover. What this means is that the government controls the tap. By deciding how much land to release for development, it effectively controls the housing supply. For decades, the unwritten approach has been to keep that tap only slightly open. The government sells a limited number of land leases each year, typically auctioning off sites to the highest bidder. And because land is scarce, those bids are enormous. This practice is often referred to as Hong Kong's high land price policy. By deliberately restricting land supply, the government ensures that land prices, and thus housing prices, remain high. Why would a government want expensive land? Money. Land sales, known as land premiums, have long been a cash cow for the government. In some years, revenues from land sales rival or exceed income from taxes. For example, in 2016-17, land premiums accounted for about 22% of Hong Kong's government revenue, plus another approximately 11% came from stamp duties on property transactions. Combined, roughly one-third of government revenue that year was property-related. This is huge. Hong Kong famously has no sales tax, low income taxes, and generally a lean tax structure, in part because it leans on land sales to fill the coffers. So the government has a built-in incentive to keep land values high and rising. If it flooded the market with cheap land, home prices would fall and the government's revenue would nosedive. That's a big reason why you don't see Hong Kong aggressively rezoning country parks or building massive new public housing towns overnight. Doing so might solve the housing crisis, but it would also break this revenue model. Instead, the government tends to release land in drips and drabs, often preferring to sell luxury sites that fetch top dollar. This policy choice propels a cycle of high prices by design. To illustrate, imagine a parcel of land comes up for auction in Kowloon. Because so few plots become available, developers will bid fiercely, driving the price into the billions of Hong Kong dollars. The government smiles because it just made a fortune. But the developer who won now must sell apartments at a very high price to recoup that investment. So they build luxury condos or microflats marketed at premium rates. Middle-class families often can't afford these, which keeps supply of truly affordable housing almost nil. And if the market ever softens, the government can simply hold off on selling land for a while to keep supply tight. It's a tap they can open or close to manage prices, and they usually err on the side of less supply, higher prices. The second pillar is the power of Hong Kong's property developers. The industry is dominated by a few giant companies, often dubbed the property tycoons. Just 5 developers account for about 77% of new private housing supply, an astonishingly concentrated market. These include companies like Sun Hung Kai Properties, CK Asset Holdings, Li Ka-shing's firm, Henderson Land, New World Development, and Sino Land, among a couple of others. They're massive conglomerates with holdings in not just housing, but shopping malls, infrastructure, utilities. Their influence over the economy is huge. How does this oligopoly affect housing? For one, at those government land auctions we talked about, these big players are usually the only ones who can afford to bid. They have deep war chests, so they consistently win the prime land tenders. Smaller developers or foreign entrants can rarely compete, so the big locals maintain a near cartel. Over decades, this has meant the same few families and companies effectively control Hong Kong's housing production. With such outsized market power, these developers can influence prices by controlling the pace of new project releases. They often strategically time when to put new units up for sale, so as not to oversaturate the market. In some cases, they even withhold units from sale, dribbling them out in phases, to keep prices from dropping. It's textbook oligopoly behavior. Don't flood the market. Keep supply just a bit less than demand to maintain pricing power. Moreover, these companies naturally focus on maximizing profit, which means they predominantly build high-end housing. If you look at the new developments in Hong Kong, you'll find lots of luxury estates, or at least homes marketed as upscale, with fancy clubhouses and high price tags. Even when they build smaller units, they often still price them expensively per square foot. Why? because targeting wealthy buyers and investors is more lucrative than building truly affordable homes. The mass market of affordable housing is largely left to public housing programs, not private developers, because the profit margins on luxury are much higher. Another tactic, land hoarding. Big developers have historically bought up vast tracts of agricultural land in the new territories. They sit on this land, literally waiting for a more favorable time to develop, or for government infrastructure, like new rail lines, to boost the land's value. Some of this land might sit idle for years or decades. Again, this restricts effective supply. Critics accuse them of holding the city's future housing hostage to protect their profits. The outcome of Pillar 2 is that competition is limited. There's little pressure to build cheaper housing or innovate in affordability. The Big Five are quite comfortable with the status quo of high prices. It's enormously profitable for them. In fact, Hong Kong's richest individuals are nearly all property tycoons, reflecting how this oligopoly has reaped the rewards of the constrained housing market. The third pillar is something we touched on earlier: the government's fiscal dependence on land and property. It's almost an addiction. Because land sales and property-related taxes fill such a large portion of government revenue, the entire fiscal structure of Hong Kong is built on expensive land. Let's put some numbers on that. Over the past decades, land premiums, the lump sum payments developers give the government for leases, have often contributed anywhere from 10% up to 30% of annual revenue, depending on the year. Add in stamp duties, taxes on property transactions, and in boom years, you get close to 1/3 or more of revenue coming from real estate. This allows Hong Kong to have low taxes elsewhere, no VAT, low corporate taxes, etc. It's a model that worked great when property values only went up. But it also means the government has skin in the game for high housing prices. If home prices plummet, not only do land sales halt, but stamp duty income dries up because transactions slow down. The government could suddenly face budget deficits or be forced to raise taxes elsewhere, politically and economically painful. So there's an inherent bias. Policies tend to favor not undercutting the property market. It's as if the government and homeowners and developers are all sitting on one big inflated balloon. No one wants to be the one to deflate it because everyone's finances are tied to it. This is often described as an iron triangle of interests. On one side, the government relies on land revenue. On the second side, developers rely on high prices for profit. And on the third side, existing property owners, a significant voting bloc, rely on high values for their wealth. Many middle-class Hong Kongers have their life savings in their flat. Who's not in this triangle? People who don't yet own homes, the younger generation, the poor. They're outside, getting squeezed. The system isn't maliciously designed to hurt them, but that's the effect. Those inside the property game want prices up. Those outside get left behind. This also explains why meaningful reform is hard. If the government suddenly did something radical like release a ton of land for cheap public housing or impose draconian taxes on developers hoarding land, property prices would likely fall. That could cause backlash from homeowners and destabilize the economy. So policymakers tiptoe carefully, making only gradual changes. It's like a delicate balancing act, trying to tweak the machine without breaking it, and often that means the status quo largely prevails. Up to now, we've dissected the economics, the policies, the players, the money flows. But this isn't just an economic story, it's a human one. This is the midpoint of our journey, and it's where the narrative shifts from how the machine works to what the machine has done to society. The housing machine of Hong Kong, the high-price policy, the developer cartel, the fiscal reliance, it successfully created one of the world's most financially wealthy cities. It generated budget surpluses, gleaming skyscrapers, and billionaire fortunes. However, it's come at a profound social cost. It has strained the unwritten social contract that Hong Kong once cherished. The idea that if you work hard, you can build a better life, maybe even buy your own home. That promise is now broken for many. Hong Kong wasn't always an impossible housing market for the average person. In the post-war decades, there was an implicit social contract between the city and its citizens. Hong Kongers embraced something called the Lion Rock spirit, a can-do, work-hard attitude symbolized by the iconic Lion Rock Mountain overlooking the city. The ethos was simple. Through hard work, thrift, and perseverance, you and your family could move up in life. For many, that meant going from a squatter hut or a public housing tenement in the 1960s to owning a small flat or a nicer home by the 1980s or 90s. Home ownership was the ultimate badge of making it, the concrete reward for the Lion Rock spirit of self-improvement. Indeed, Hong Kong's government once heavily promoted home ownership. Large public housing programs rehoused refugees from shacks into estates. Later, schemes like the home ownership program sold apartments at subsidized prices to middle-income families. By the early 2000s, over half the population lived in either public rental or subsidized sale housing. The system wasn't perfect, but the aspirational narrative held, if you study, work, save, you too can get a home. This was the Lion Rock social contract. The city doesn't provide welfare in the Western sense. Taxes are low, you fend for yourself. But if you work hard, the market will reward you and you can stake your claim, often symbolized by owning property. Now fast forward to today. For a huge swath of Hong Kong's younger generation, that contract has disintegrated. Home prices have far outpaced incomes. In 2003, during a post-bubble low, a middle-class family might have afforded a flat at maybe 5 or 6 times their annual income. But today, that multiple is around 16 to 17 times income on average, even after some recent dips. Salaries simply haven't grown anywhere near that fast. The graph of housing price versus median income over the last 30 years looks like a wide scissors gap, with home prices shooting to the moon while incomes inch up slowly. The result is that a typical young professional, even a university graduate with a decent job, might never afford to buy a home without help. Banks often require a 20 to 30% down payment. On an 5 million Hong Kong dollars starter flat, which might be just 300 square feet, that's 1 to 1.5 million Hong Kong dollars in cash needed, roughly 150,000 US dollars to start, for a tiny home. How long would it take a middle-class person to save that? One study found Hong Kongers expect it would take 17 years on average to save enough for a down payment, basically your entire youth and more. Some said it could take over 20 years if you're not exceptionally frugal. By the time you've saved, the goalposts may have moved further out. So what do people do? Many give up on owning and stay with their parents into their 30s, common here, or they rent subdivided rooms. Some couples postpone marriage because they feel they must get a flat first, a traditional expectation, but can't afford one. Others take on huge mortgages, stretching 30 years, and basically devote their entire working life to paying off a shoebox-sized apartment. Imagine signing a mortgage in your 20s that you won't finish paying until you're almost 60, for an apartment perhaps smaller than an American garage. For those who can't see a path to ownership, life in Hong Kong can start to feel like a dead end. You work long hours. Hong Kongers are some of the hardest working people, with long office hours as norm. You pay high rents for a tiny space, and you still can't save enough because housing eats your income. The Lion Rock spirit was about hope, the faith that your sacrifices will pay off. But if housing is unattainable, that hope fades. This is what we mean by a broken social contract. In essence, the housing crisis has put Hong Kong's Lion Rock spirit in a cage. The belief that hard work leads to success is undermined when even success doesn't lead to a livable home. People start questioning, what am I working towards? Is the Hong Kong dream dead? This is a dangerous place for a society to be, when the young lose hope and the old lose faith in progress.